So, the contract is signed. I am ruined.
The marriage contract lay between them like a death sentence, ink still wet, sealing fates neither had chosen. Lord Dominic Ashford, the war wolf of Waterloo, stared at the trembling girl across his study with eyes cold as winter frost. She was his enemy's daughter, the spawn of the man who had betrayed his brother to a French firing squad. Every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance, yet honor and his dying father's debts had bound him to this unholy union. He had sworn an oath that morning, standing before her pale, frightened face. He would give her his name, his protection, his roof, but never his heart, never his attention, never a single word more than necessity demanded. He would make her a ghost in his own house, invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. It was the cruelest punishment he could devise without breaking his vow. But as she lifted her eyes, those impossibly green eyes swimming with unshed tears, and whispered words that would haunt him for weeks to come, Dominic felt the first crack in his carefully constructed armor. "I understand, my lord," she had said softly. "You need not pretend I exist. I am quite accustomed to being no one at all." The rain fell like punishment upon Ashford Hall, turning the gravel drive to rivers of gray sorrow. Inside, the servants moved like wraiths through corridors that had known no laughter since the war, their footsteps muffled by Persian carpets now faded with neglect. At the center of this cold grandeur sat Lord Dominic Ashford, watching the flames devour another log in the library hearth, whiskey glass forgotten in his scarred hand. He had returned from the continent with a limp, a reputation for ruthlessness, and a hatred so pure it had sustained him through 3 years of hunting the traitor who sold English positions to Napoleon. That traitor, Lord Edmund Hartley, had died in his bed before Dominic could exact justice. But Hartley had left behind something Dominic could punish, a daughter. Lady Genevieve Hartley, 19 years old, orphaned, penniless, and now his wife by arrangement of their fathers before the war, a contract neither could break without scandal that would destroy both family names. Dominic's father, on his deathbed, had begged his son to honor the agreement, and so, with a heart full of venom and a soul carved hollow by loss, Dominic had wed the enemy's child that very morning in a ceremony barren of warmth or witnesses. She sat now in the east wing, exactly where he'd ordered her kept, far from his sight, far from his thoughts, or so he desperately hoped. Genevieve sat in the window seat of her assigned chambers, watching rain streak the ancient glass like tears she refused to shed. The room was beautiful in its desolation, velvet curtains the color of moss, a 4-poster bed draped in silk that whispered with her slightest movement, furniture polished to a mirror shine. A cage, she thought, gilded and lovely, but a cage nonetheless. She had known this marriage would be loveless. Her father's solicitor had explained everything 3 days after the funeral, when the debts were tallied and her future sold to satisfy them. Lord Ashford required a wife to fulfill an old obligation. She required survival. It was, the solicitor had assured her with false cheer, a practical arrangement. But she had not anticipated the Ice Lord's absolute contempt. The way his gray eyes had raked over her in the chapel, cataloging her deficiencies with surgical precision, the rigid set of his jaw when the vicar pronounced them bound, the silence, that terrible, suffocating silence as their carriage rolled toward Ashford Hall, 2 strangers trapped in mutual loathing. Her father's sins were not hers. She wanted to scream it, but what purpose would it serve? Lord Ashford had decided who she was before ever meeting her. Traitor's daughter, enemy, penance. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. A maid entered, young and kind-faced, carrying a supper tray. "His lordship says you're to eat, milady," she murmured, setting the tray upon a small table. "He asks that you keep to your rooms this evening. He has business to attend." Of course he did, business that did not include acknowledging his wife's existence. "Thank you," Genevieve whispered. The maid curtsied and fled, leaving her alone once more with the rain and her regrets. Dominic stood in his study, the marriage certificate mocking him from his desk. His hand tightened around the whiskey glass until his knuckles whitened, the burn of alcohol doing nothing to numb the fury coiled in his chest like a serpent waiting to strike. Edmund Hartley's daughter slept under his roof, ate his food, bore his name. The thought was acid in his throat. He closed his eyes and saw, as he always did, his brother's face. Thomas was golden where Dominic was dark, gentle where Dominic was severe, beloved by all who knew him. And Edmund Hartley had sold the intelligence that put Thomas in the path of French muskets, for money, for meaningless, blood-soaked gold. Dominic had spent 3 years tracking the traitor through the smoking ruins of Europe, piecing together evidence, following whispers. He had been 2 weeks from confronting Hartley when fever claimed the bastard first, robbing Dominic of the vengeance that was his right. Now he was left with this, a girl who carried her father's blood, her father's name, her father's guilt. "You're punishing an innocent," his mother's voice echoed in memory. She had written from Bath, begging him to reconsider, to show mercy. But mercy was a luxury Dominic could no longer afford. Mercy had died with Thomas on a battlefield far from home.
He poured another drink, then another, until the edges of his rage softened into something duller, more sustainable. Indifference. Yes, that was the answer. He would simply pretend she did not exist, a ghost haunting the East Wing, irrelevant and unseen. It would be easy, he told himself, ignoring the memory of her eyes, green as spring leaves, pooling with carefully restrained tears. So damnably easy. 3 days passed in suffocating silence. Genevieve took her meals alone, walked the portrait gallery alone, sat in the music room before a pianoforte she dared not play. The servants treated her with cautious courtesy, but she saw the questions in their eyes. What sort of marriage was this, where husband and wife existed as strangers in separate wings? She had tried, that first morning, to approach Lord Ashford at breakfast. She had descended early, hope fluttering foolishly in her chest, thinking perhaps daylight and duty might soften his resolve. But when she entered the dining room, he had looked up from his correspondence with such naked hostility that words died unspoken on her tongue. He had risen, folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, and left, without a single syllable passing his lips. The message was clear. She was unwelcome even in shared spaces. So she retreated, as she had learned to do in her father's house when his temper darkened. Invisibility was a skill she had perfected long before this marriage. Be quiet, be small, be nothing at all, survive. On the 4th morning, she woke to discover a note slipped beneath her door. The handwriting was sharp, masculine, unforgiving. "You will attend dinner tonight. We have guests. Present yourself appropriately. Do not embarrass me." Genevieve's hands trembled as she read it once, twice, 3 times. He required her presence, but only as ornament, only as proof of respectability before witnesses. She was to be trotted out like a prize mare, displayed and dismissed. Very well. If Lord Ashford wanted a decorative wife who spoke only when spoken to, she would give him exactly that. She had survived worse than indifference. She would survive this, too, even if it hollowed her out completely. The gown laid out for her was exquisite, pale blue silk with ivory lace, cut to flatter without drawing undue attention. Genevieve wondered who had selected it.
Surely not her husband, who could barely stand to acknowledge her existence. Perhaps the housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, who had shown her small kindnesses these past days. She dressed with care, pinning her dark hair in a simple style that would not invite criticism. No jewels adorned her throat, she owned none, but the candlelight would be forgiving. She studied her reflection with detachment, seeing what Lord Ashford would see, an adequate wife, properly attired, sufficiently invisible. When she descended the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, she found him waiting in the entrance hall. He wore evening blacks that emphasized the harsh lines of his face, the military precision of his bearing. He did not smile. He did not offer his arm. He simply assessed her with those winter storm eyes, looking for flaws he might catalogue and resent. "The Carswells are old family friends," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You will be polite, demure, and speak only if directly addressed. You will not mention your father. You will not embarrass me. Do you understand?" Each word was a small violence. Genevieve lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with hard-won composure. "Perfectly, my lord." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, that she did not cower or weep, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that impenetrable coldness. "Good," he said, and finally, grudgingly, offered his arm. She placed her hand upon his sleeve, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles, the heat of him burning through expensive fabric. For one breath, two, they stood suspended in mutual awareness before he moved, guiding her toward the drawing room where voices and laughter waited, sounds foreign in this house of ghosts. The Carswells proved to be exactly as Genevieve expected, a jovial baronet with a fondness for port, and his wife, a pleasant woman who smiled too much and noticed too keenly. Their daughter, a striking blonde named Cecilia, watched Lord Ashford with barely concealed longing that made Genevieve's stomach twist with something she refused to name as jealousy. Dinner unfolded with agonizing formality. Genevieve sat at the far end of the table, her husband a distant, forbidding presence at its head. She spoke when addressed. Yes, the weather was fine. No, she had not yet explored the gardens. Yes, Ashford Hall was quite grand, and otherwise remained silent, a decorative statue in blue silk. Lord Ashford ignored her completely, directing all conversation towards Sir Carswell and his daughter. When Cecilia laughed at something he said, touching his arm with casual intimacy, Genevieve felt each breath grow sharper, more difficult. "And how are you finding married life, Lady Ashford?" Lady Carswell asked suddenly, her keen eyes studying Genevieve with unsettling focus. The table fell silent. Genevieve felt her husband's gaze upon her, heavy with unspoken warning. She set down her fork with careful precision, summoning every lesson in deportment her governess had beaten into her. "It is an adjustment, Lady Carswell," she said, softly, truthfully. "But Ashford Hall is beautiful, and I am grateful for Lord Ashford's—" She paused, searching for a word that was not quite a lie. "Generosity." Dominic's jaw tightened. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, that she had not played her part with more enthusiasm. Or perhaps recognition that her words held multiple meanings, none of them complimentary. "How lovely," Lady Carswell murmured, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. The remainder of dinner stretched like eternity, each course another small torture, until Genevieve thought she might shatter from the weight of pretending. If you're captivated by Genevieve's quiet strength and Lord Ashford's frozen heart, stay with us. The walls he's built are about to crumble in ways neither of them can anticipate. Don't miss what happens when indifference becomes impossible and hate transforms into something far more dangerous. Subscribe and let this story unfold. The Carswells departed near midnight, their carriage wheels crunching over gravel, as Genevieve stood in the entrance hall, her face aching from hours of false smiles. The moment the door closed, Lord Ashford turned on her with controlled fury that made the air crackle between them. "Your gratitude for my generosity?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You dare mock me in front of guests?" Genevieve lifted her chin, exhaustion fraying the edges of her carefully maintained composure. "I spoke only truth, my lord. You have been exceedingly generous, with your contempt, your silence, your determination to pretend I do not exist except when performance demands otherwise." His eyes widened fractionally, as if he had not expected defiance from the mouse he had married. "You forget yourself." "No, my lord." Her voice remained steady, despite the trembling in her hands. "I know exactly who I am. I am the daughter of a traitor, the wife you despise, the punishment you inflict upon yourself for sins that were never mine to commit. But I will not apologize for surviving what you have made of this marriage." The words hung between them, sharp as shattered glass. For a moment she thought he might shout, might finally unleash the rage she felt simmering beneath his icy exterior. Instead, something shifted in his expression, confusion, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of shame. "You know nothing of what I have endured," he said, but the certainty had drained from his voice. "And you know nothing of me," she replied quietly, "yet you have already judged me guilty." She turned then, gathering her skirts, and climbed the stairs toward her lonely chambers, leaving him standing in the flickering candlelight, his certainty cracking like ice beneath spring sun. Sleep eluded Dominic that night. He paced his chambers like a caged wolf, her words echoing in his mind with maddening persistence. "You have already judged me guilty." Had he? Yes, of course he had. She was Hartley's daughter. That fact alone condemned her. Yet something in her eyes haunted him, not fear, as he had expected, but a weary resignation that spoke of other battles fought and lost long before she had encountered his cruelty. She had not wept or pleaded. She had simply stated truth with quiet dignity that made him feel suddenly uncomfortably small. He remembered her at dinner, speaking only when addressed, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect, despite the tension radiating from her slender frame. He had watched Cecilia Carswell preen and flirt, had felt nothing but mild irritation at her transparent attempts to recapture his attention. But when Lady Carswell had questioned Genevieve, he had found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response, with an intensity that unsettled him. "I am grateful for Lord Ashford's generosity." The words had been perfectly chosen, appropriate for their audience, yet laden with accusation for him alone. She was clever, his unwanted wife, clever and wounded and far more resilient than he had given her credit. Damn her for making him see it. As dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Dominic made a decision. He would observe her, this girl he had sworn to ignore. Not from kindness, he told himself, but from strategy. "Know your enemy," his commanding officer had always said. "Understand them before you destroy them." But as he recalled the defeated set of her shoulders as she climbed the stairs, he wondered uncomfortably whether it was possible to destroy someone already so thoroughly broken. Genevieve discovered the library by accident 3 days later, wandering corridors that twisted like a labyrinth through Ashford Hall's ancient bones. The door stood ajar, revealing floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound volumes that made her heart leap with desperate longing. Books had been her refuge in her father's house, the only place she could escape his rages and her own inadequacy. She entered quietly, reverently, running her fingers along dusty spines until she found a collection of poetry. She had just settled into a window seat, the book open in her lap, when his voice shattered her solitude. "I did not give you permission to use this room." She startled, the book tumbling from her hands. Lord Ashford stood in the doorway, imposing and cold, yet something in his expression seemed less hostile than before, merely surprised, perhaps, to find her here. I apologize, my lord, she said, rising quickly, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. I did not know it was forbidden. I will leave immediately. But as she moved to pass him, he stepped sideways, blocking her path, not threateningly, but deliberately. What were you reading? The question caught her off guard. She gestured helplessly toward the fallen book. Wordsworth, my lord. I found comfort in poetry once. Once, before her world collapsed, before she became his unwilling prisoner. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as though attempting to solve some puzzle that vexed him. Then, inexplicably, he bent and retrieved the book, holding it out to her with something almost resembling gentleness. "The library is available to you," he said stiffly. "I would not deny anyone access to books." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the volume, and heat shocked through her at the contact. His eyes darkened, and she wondered if he felt it too, that strange, unwelcome awareness crackling between them like summer lightning. "Thank you," she whispered. He left without another word, but something had shifted, some wall had thinned, and Genevieve found herself staring at the empty doorway long after his footsteps faded. Dominic found himself inventing excuses to pass by the library over the following days. He told himself it was coincidence, that his routines simply happened to take him past that particular door. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. He wanted to see her again, this quiet ghost who read poetry in window seats and asked for nothing. He discovered her patterns quickly. She came each afternoon when he thought him occupied with estate business, curling into that same window seat like a cat seeking sunlight. She read voraciously, poetry, philosophy, novels he himself had purchased years ago and forgotten. Sometimes her lips moved as she read, forming silent words that made something tighten painfully behind his ribs. On the fifth day, he entered while she was there, pretending surprise, though he had timed it precisely. She looked up, those green eyes widening, but did not flee as he expected. "My lord," she acknowledged softly, preparing to leave. "Stay," he said, then gentler. "Please, I came for a book myself." It was partially true. He had come for a book, and to see if she would run from him again. She hesitated, conflict warring across her expressive face, before sinking back into her seat with obvious reluctance. They existed in tense silence for several minutes, the only sound the whisper of turning pages. Then, unexpectedly, he heard her laugh, a small, quickly stifled sound that made him look up sharply. "Forgive me," she said, color flooding her cheeks. "The author made an observation that struck me as particularly amusing." "Which author?" he asked, before he could stop himself. She showed him the page, a satirical essay on London society. Despite himself, he felt his mouth twitch toward something dangerously close to a smile. "Bellamy is rather savage in his assessments." "Truth often is, my lord." Their eyes met and held, and for the first time since their disastrous wedding, Dominic saw not his enemy's daughter, but simply a young woman who loved books as fiercely as he once had, before war stole such gentle pleasures from him. "You may call me Dominic," he heard himself say, "when we are alone." Her breath caught, surprise and something softer flickering across her features. "Genevieve," she offered quietly. "My name is Genevieve." And though they returned to their reading, the silence between them had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like companionship. The thaw came gradually, like spring creeping across frozen ground. Dominic found himself spending afternoons in the library, ostensibly reading, but more often watching Genevieve as she lost herself in literature. They began discussing books, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. He discovered she possessed a sharp wit and sharper intelligence, that she could debate philosophy and dissect poetry with skill that left him unexpectedly challenged. She made him laugh, this girl he had sworn to despise. Worse, she made him feel human again. Something beyond the war wolf, beyond the avenging brother, beyond the cold lord who had locked his heart away with his brother's memory. One afternoon, as golden autumn light streamed through the windows, Dominic found himself speaking of Thomas. The words emerged unbidden, carried on the wings of trust he had not meant to offer. He told her of his brother's gentleness, his laughter, his dreams of a peaceful life after the war. And when tears gathered in Genevieve's eyes, they were not for herself, but for the brother he had lost, for the grief he carried like penance. "I am so sorry," she whispered, and he heard no artifice in her voice, only genuine sorrow. "I cannot undo what my father did. I cannot restore what was stolen from you. But I am sorry, Dominic, sorrier than words can adequately convey." Something cracked inside him then, some final barrier crumbling beneath the weight of her compassion. He reached for her hand, that small, trembling hand, and held it as though it were something precious, rather than something to be endured. "I have been cruel to you," he said, the admission tearing from somewhere deep within his chest. "I blamed you for sins that were never yours. I punished you for my own inability to save him. She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "We have both been prisoners of the past, my lord. Perhaps it is time we chose differently. Perhaps we could begin again, not as enemies bound by obligation, but as two people who have found unexpected kinship in a library full of books and honest words." He stared at her, this woman he had tried so desperately to ignore, and saw her clearly for the first time. Not his enemy's daughter, but Genevieve, brave, intelligent, kind despite every reason to be bitter. Genevieve, who had endured his cruelty with dignity and met his hatred with grace. Genevieve, whom he had somehow, impossibly, begun to love. "I would like that," he whispered, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I would like that very much." She smiled then, a real smile, radiant and transformative, and Dominic felt the last of his carefully constructed ice melt away beneath its warmth. He leaned closer, drawn by forces he no longer wished to resist, and when their lips met, it was not from obligation or duty, but from choice, from a future neither had dared imagine, blooming suddenly, miraculously possible. Outside, the rain that had plagued Ashford Hall for weeks finally ceased, and sunlight broke through clouds like a benediction, bathing them both in golden light as they held each other, two wounded souls finding unexpected healing in the last place either had thought to look, in each other's arms. Lord Ashford planned to ignore his enemy's daughter, to make her invisible in his house of ghosts. But Genevieve's quiet strength shattered his icy resolve, and in the healing space between hatred and love, they found something neither had dared hope for, a future written not by their father's sins, but by their own brave hearts. If this story touched you, if you believe in love's power to heal even the deepest wounds, subscribe for more tales of hearts remade and second chances claimed. Like, share, and let us know in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were exactly what your heart needed? Until next time, dear readers, may you find your own unexpected love in the most surprising places.